There was an orb there about the size of a softball, and it was grayish, leatherish looking. And I said to myself, oh, I hope this isn't what I think it is.
She met the wrong guys. She got pregnant, and uh, all kinds of bad things happened.
The storage unit had been untouched for years, its rent long overdue. For Thomas, this auction was a first. He hadn't come looking for hidden treasures, but rather hoping to score some decent furniture. He'd been outbid on another unit earlier in the day, one that seemed more promising. Still, when unit number 6 came up, he figured it was worth a shot. Maybe there'd be something useful inside. When he opened the unit, though, there wasn't much to be excited about, just a bunch of old boxes that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. No furniture, no antiques, just dusty cardboard. Still, Thomas decided to load them up and take them home, hoping maybe there was something worth keeping. That evening, he started sifting through the contents. A few outdated computer parts, an old Nintendo system, but nothing that seemed valuable. Frustrated, he set the boxes aside. The next day at work, Thomas mentioned his lackluster find to a buddy, who eagerly offered to take anything off his hands. With nothing to lose, Thomas went back home that night to take another look. Maybe there was something he missed, something buried deeper in those dusty boxes. As he began to unpack them again, something caught his attention, something that felt off. Inside one of the boxes, beneath the layers of old papers and forgotten trinkets, was something no one could have expected. The storage unit Thomas had won once belonged to Diane Odell. By 2003, Diane was nearly 50, living what appeared to be a busy but typical life. She was a mother of 9 children, her youngest just 4 years old, while the oldest were already adults with families of their own. Her life revolved around raising her kids and managing a large blended family. Diane grew up in Queens, a borough of New York City known for its dense neighborhoods and fast pace of life. As she got older, she moved to upstate New York, an area far more rural than the city she had once called home. It was there she met Robert, her common-law husband. This was another chance at a family life after a divorce from her previous husband. Over the years, Diane and Robert had moved frequently, spending time in Pennsylvania, Arizona, and even Utah, before finally moving back to upstate New York. On the surface, her life seemed ordinary. But behind the scenes, secrets from her past had been carefully packed away until the discovery of that storage unit would bring them all to light. According to Diane, her world was shaped by a childhood filled with trauma, and her home life was very unstable. Her father drank heavily, and his temper often flared into violence. She recalled the belt whippings and the nights locked away in the basement, a punishment she endured more times than she could count. The house was filled with constant tension. Her father and brothers were always at each other's throats, and one day the violence escalated to a physical fight between her father and one of her brothers. It was that moment that led Diane and her mother to finally leave. For Diane, leaving felt like an escape, but the sense of relief didn't last. Even though her father was out of the picture, the abuse didn't end. According to her, her father had been hurting her in far worse ways behind closed doors. While her mother was out, Diane was forced to stay with him. She claimed that her mother knew what was happening but did nothing to stop it. By the time Diane turned 16, things took another dark turn. Her mother, Diane said, began sending her out with men, though she never knew where the money she brought home ended up. It was a life she hadn't expected, and by age 17 she dropped out of high school, struggling under the weight of her situation. A year later, she and her mother moved upstate, leaving the city behind. But despite the change of scenery, Diane's past continued to follow her. When Diane and her mother moved, the fresh start she had hoped for was overshadowed by a secret she was keeping. She had become pregnant, but the baby's father was a mystery. though she feared it might have been her own father. She claims that when she told her mother, the reaction wasn't one of concern or support. Instead, her mother insisted she shouldn't keep the baby, sparking months of arguments. Diane says that after enduring the emotional strain for too long, she finally left. She went to the one person she thought might help, her father. But instead of finding refuge, she faced even more violence. According to Diane, her father beat her viciously, kicking her and sending her back to her mother's house, broken and in pain. The trauma from that night sent her into early labor, and the baby, her first, didn't survive. What came next was something Diane said she could never forget. Instead of mourning or grieving, her mother told her to bury the baby in the backyard, as if it were no different than a dead pet. But Diane couldn't bring herself to do it. She wasn't ready to let go, not completely. So instead, she wrapped the small body and placed it in a blue suitcase. She packed it away in the closet where it could be hidden, out of sight and out of mind. And for a while, that's exactly where it stayed. The baby, her secret, tucked away in the shadows of her life. When Diane was around 20, she and her mother moved again, and with them came all of their belongings, including the blue suitcase, which remained in her mother's closet, undisturbed. Not long after, Diane met Jonathan, the man who would become her first husband. At first, their life together seemed promising, but shortly after they married, Jonathan got devastating news. He was diagnosed with kidney failure and needed to be placed on dialysis. Diane, still trying to find her own footing, suddenly became his caretaker, working minimum wage jobs to support them while also tending to his medical needs. After what felt like an endless struggle, a donor was finally found, and Jonathan received the kidney transplant he so desperately needed. With the surgery behind him, Jonathan slowly regained his strength and began to resemble his old self again. But that change came with a heartbreaking shift for Diane. According to her, once Jonathan recovered, he decided he didn't want to be married anymore. Devastated, Diane moved back in with her mother, who wasn't about to let her forget the promise Diane had made when she was young, that she would take care of her in her old age. Guilt played its role, and soon Diane found herself fulfilling that obligation, even as she tried to rebuild her own life. When Diane met James, her second husband, and married him, she thought things would be different. But even then, her mother's influence lingered. Eventually, her mother moved in with them, bringing her dominating presence into their home. Diane's mother left behind the blue suitcase, still containing the remains of Diane's first baby, in the attic of a house she had been renting, perhaps hoping it would remain buried in Diane's past. By the summer of 1978, Diane gave birth to her first child with James, a baby girl. But by winter, Diane was pregnant again. What should have been a time of joy turned into a time of stress. Living with her mother had strained their marriage, and James began spending more and more time with his single brother. Diane suspected he was seeing other women, and she was left to manage things on her own. At first, Diane didn't want to tell James about her second pregnancy. She was already struggling with the weight of her mother's presence and the pressures it had put on their marriage. But after the baby was born, James decided he wanted to give their relationship another chance. He had one condition, though. They had to leave Diane's mother behind and move to Florida. With Diane and James gone, Diane's mother was left to live on her own. The blue suitcase tucked away in the attic of her previous rental was forgotten, at least for a time. But when the landlord of that old house decided to retire and sell the property, something unexpected surfaced. As he was clearing out the attic, preparing the house for sale, he stumbled upon the old blue suitcase. At first, he assumed it was just another forgotten item left behind by a tenant. But when he opened it, what he found inside was far more disturbing than he could have imagined. It didn't take long for him to realize exactly what he was looking at. Panicked and unsure of what to do, he called Diane's mother and demanded she come collect it immediately, or he would be calling the police. She retrieved the suitcase, left without a word, and the landlord never saw her again. He tried to put the unsettling discovery out of his mind, but the memory of that suitcase, and what it contained, would come back to haunt him decades later. James and Diane's move to Florida didn't solve their problems. Instead, things got worse. Robert was drinking heavily and spending more time with other women, leaving Diane feeling abandoned and disillusioned. Fed up with his behavior, she made the difficult decision to leave him. Pregnant once again, she packed up her young daughters and returned to New York, back to her mother's house. By now, Diane's father had passed away, but his absence didn't offer much relief. Diane was raising her daughters on her own, with only her mother to help babysit. Life was hard, and the responsibility of single motherhood weighed heavily on her. It was during this time that Diane went into labor with her next child. But instead of rushing to the hospital, she waited. She didn't want to be sent home if her contractions weren't close enough together, something that had happened before. But this time, she waited too long. When her water broke, Diane says she passed out from the pain. When she woke up, there was a baby boy lying next to her, but he wasn't crying. He wasn't moving. According to Diane, her mother told her that the baby had breathing difficulties and didn't survive. Diane wanted to call for help, but her mother stopped her. She warned Diane that if they called an ambulance, the authorities would blame her for the baby's death, and her daughters would lose their mother. Faced with the fear of losing her children, and knowing she couldn't trust her own mother to care for them, Diane made a decision. She agreed to do what her mother suggested. They would get rid of the body, like they had done last time. Diane had a brief relationship with a new boyfriend, but it didn't last. Struggling to manage life as a single mother, she eventually turned to James's brother for comfort. The relationship led to another pregnancy. Diane claims that this time, as before, things took a tragic turn. She went into labor but delayed getting help, just like the previous pregnancy. As the contractions intensified, she began to bleed heavily, and soon she passed out. When she woke up, her mother was there, and the baby wasn't breathing. According to Diane, the situation unfolded in much the same way as the last time. Her mother was there when she regained consciousness, and once again there was nothing that could be done. By 1985, Diane says she had repeated the process for a third time. Once again, she found herself pregnant, and once again the same sad pattern unfolded. She went into labor, bled heavily, and passed out, and woke up to find her mother by her side and another lifeless baby. Just like before, her mother took control of the situation. The baby was placed in a box and stored away in the closet, along with the others. Diane soon met Robert, her future common-law husband, and again she became pregnant. But this time things were different. She says she kept the pregnancy a secret from her mother. Diane had gained weight, which allowed her to hide the signs, and when she gave birth to her fourth child, she did it without her mother's interference. For the first time, she felt like she was in control. But despite the small victory, the presence of her mother and the hidden boxes loomed over Diane's life. She began to feel that the babies in those boxes weren't just secrets, they were weapons. Her mother knew what happened, and she feared that if her mother ever wanted to, she could use the knowledge against her. Diane was terrified that her mother might tell Robert about the babies, which made her feel trapped. Wherever they went, her mother had to come too, and Diane couldn't break free from her hold. And whenever the family moved, whether it was to a new house or even just across town, the boxes, along with the blue suitcase, were always the first thing Diane would move. In the summer of 1987, during one of their many moves, Diane and Robert left behind an old broken-down car. It had been sitting unused for some time, no longer running. When it was finally towed away, Diane didn't give much thought to what was inside. What she didn't realize was that the blue suitcase, the same one she had carefully kept hidden for years, was still in the trunk. For a while, the car sat rusting in a junkyard, forgotten and waiting to be scrapped. But before it could be crushed, a junkyard worker went through the car to salvage anything of value. That's when he found the suitcase. Curious, he opened it, and inside were the remains of a baby. The discovery prompted a full investigation, and by early 1989, the police were knocking on Diane's door. At first, Diane denied knowing anything about it. Yes, she admitted the suitcase was hers, but she claimed she had no idea how the remains had ended up inside. The police weren't convinced. They had questions, and as investigators continued digging, they got statements from Diane's past landlords, who remembered the blue suitcase and how Diane's mother had once picked it up under strange circumstances. Faced with mounting pressure, Diane changed her story. She admitted that the baby had been hers. She claimed the baby's father was her own father, who had beaten her severely during the pregnancy. According to Diane, she had gone into early labor and the baby was stillborn. The remains belonged to a baby girl, whom authorities would later refer to as Baby Doe. However, given the lack of forensic evidence, there was no way to definitively prove whether the baby had been born alive or not, and with Diane's father long dead, the investigation hit a dead end. Prosecutors didn't have enough to move forward with charges, and Diane was never held accountable in court. She declined to bury the child, instead releasing the remains to the state of New York, where they were laid to rest in a potter's field. What no one knew at the time was that there were 3 more babies hidden away in boxes right under their noses. For Diane Odell, it seemed the investigation was over. Her secrets were safe again. But 15 years later, the police would once again come knocking at her door. Fast forward to 2003. After the discovery of the boxes inside Diane Odell's storage locker in Arizona, investigators traced it back to her, now living in Pennsylvania. Diane was questioned by Pennsylvania authorities, but the more they pressed, the more her story seemed to shift. Initially, she tried to blame her mother, claiming that her mother was the one responsible for what had happened. Yet her statements quickly became inconsistent. Sometimes she said her mother was there, other times she wasn't. During the interview, Diane claimed that with the first baby, she had tried to clear his airway after the birth. Curiously, she had previously lied about the baby's gender, referring to it as a boy, though no one knew why. X-rays would later reveal that all the babies had been born full-term, but Diane's recollections were inconsistent. She couldn't clearly remember if she had ever heard the babies cry, or how the umbilical cords had been cut. Investigators were suspicious of how she could recall specific details about cleaning up after the births, like where she had placed the soiled towels, but was vague when it came to more important aspects, like whether she heard the babies cry. One troubling pattern stood out to investigators. All of the babies born out of wedlock, when Diane had no man in her life, ended up in boxes. This raised questions: why only these children? As questioning continued, Diane made an unusual claim. She said she kept the baby's remains to prove that it was her mother who had wanted to get rid of them, because they were born out of wedlock. Diane feared her mother might use the babies against her, maybe even threatening to tell Robert. Wherever Diane moved, her mother came with her, and so did the blue suitcase and boxes. Diane admitted that whenever they relocated, the first thing she always packed and moved herself were the boxes containing the baby's remains. But her mother had died in 1995, and there was no way to address Diane's claims. During the interviews, Robert, her common-law husband, recalled Diane asking for a lawyer. However, investigators claimed that Diane wasn't focused on criminal charges. Instead, they said she had asked for a civil attorney, more concerned with what would happen to her children if she were jailed. This struck investigators as odd. Rather than fully addressing the investigation into the deaths, Diane seemed preoccupied with ensuring her children, some of whom were not Robert's, were taken care of. Investigators also wondered how Diane could have handled multiple supposed stillbirths on her own. She claimed that during these times, her very young daughters had taken care of her after she passed out from bleeding. But this explanation only raised more questions. How had toddlers managed to care for their mother during such traumatic events? How had she hidden multiple pregnancies and births without seeking any medical attention? Given that the babies had died in New York State, the investigation was eventually handed over to the authorities there. When they took over, they quickly connected the dots to an old case, the discovery of baby Doe in 1989, found inside the blue suitcase. The pieces were falling into place, but as more details emerged with each round of questioning, Diane's tangled and conflicting story made the truth harder to grasp. As the interrogation continued, Diane began to backtrack, claiming that she had been coerced by investigators. She said the police had made suggestions about how the babies might have died, offering scenarios like, you gave birth in the bathroom, there were towels around, maybe one of them went into the baby's mouth, or maybe you passed out and your leg went over the baby. Diane claimed that, under pressure, she went along with these suggestions, struggling to piece together memories from nearly 2 decades earlier. The last baby, who died in 1985, had always been the vaguest part of Diane's story. In fact, she had once claimed she could barely remember the birth at all. But as the questioning wore on, her story changed. Diane eventually admitted that she had heard the baby cry. It was a significant shift from her earlier statements, where she had implied the babies were stillborn or had stopped breathing. Before, Diane had insisted that she kept the baby's remains to prove her mother was the one who wanted them gone. But by 2003, her mother was long dead, and Diane's statements to the New York State Police began to unravel. She now admitted that her mother hadn't even known about the pregnancies. She had hidden them all. More importantly, Diane confessed that she had heard the babies cry after they were born, but she never called 911 or sought medical help. The admission was a turning point. With her mother no longer in the picture to take the blame, Diane's story shifted entirely onto her own shoulders. As the police carefully reviewed every paragraph of her final statement, Diane signed off on it. What she had officially admitted was clear: the babies were born alive. And that confession was enough to charge Diane Odell with 3 counts of murder. But there was one death notably absent from the case. The death of the baby found in the blue suitcase was not included. Despite the chilling discovery years earlier, the court ruled that the evidence from that case could not be presented to the jury. Despite the disturbing circumstances of the earlier discovery, the judges were concerned that introducing the 1979 death might unfairly bias the jury against Diane. They feared that the jury would focus too much on her past, allowing emotion to influence their decision rather than the facts of the current case. When Diane Odell finally stood trial, she was charged with 6 counts of murder, 3 counts of intentional murder, and 3 counts of depraved indifference murder, relating to the deaths of the 3 babies found in the boxes. And the death of the baby found in the blue suitcase was notably absent from the case. At trial, the prosecution faced the challenge of proving that the deaths of the 3 babies were not accidents or the result of natural causes, but intentional murders. Their argument was that Diane didn't want the babies, born out of wedlock and with unknown fathers, so she hid their remains after intentionally killing them. The prosecution's case relied on forensic evidence and the fact that Diane had concealed the bodies for decades, maintaining that these were not stillbirths, but deliberate acts to rid herself of the, quote, bastard children. The defense, on the other hand, aimed to establish reasonable doubt. They argued that the babies had died during birth, possibly due to complications Diane couldn't handle on her own. They raised the possibility of mental health issues. Making many moves across the country with babies in boxes obviously isn't normal behavior. They sought to reduce the charges to manslaughter at best. The defense also leaned into Diane's consistent story. She had always claimed the babies died during delivery. They pointed out that Diane's statements to the New York State Police, where she admitted hearing the babies cry, were potentially coerced, as the investigators had led her in a particular direction. A key piece of evidence for the prosecution came from the pathologist, who determined that the cause of death was definitely homicide. The pathologist noted that there were no developmental defects or abnormalities in the babies, evidence they were full-term and healthy at birth, ruling out the possibility of natural death. This finding supported the prosecution's narrative that Diane had actively caused their deaths. The prosecution also had DNA evidence, which proved pivotal. Although Diane initially claimed she didn't know who the fathers were, suggesting that the pregnancies may have resulted from non-consensual incidents, her signed statements to New York State Police eventually revealed that she did know who the fathers were. While the prosecution couldn't definitively prove the paternity of 2 of the babies, they were able to match DNA from one of the babies to one of the men Diane had identified. This weakened the defense's argument that her statements to police were unreliable, as it showed she was telling the truth about the father of at least one baby. As the trial unfolded, the prosecution maintained that Diane's decision to hide the remains, along with her shifting stories, pointed to a clear intention to cover up what she had done, not an innocent mother dealing with tragic stillbirths. Diane would later express concerns about her defense team. She claimed that her public defender only began preparing her for testimony a week before the trial, which she felt wasn't enough time. Diane also had a story from her brother that she believed could impact the case. She said her brother, long before Diane was born, was asked by their mother to bury a box in the backyard. Diane saw this as potential evidence to suggest her mother had a history of hiding things. However, the defense team knew that this story would be considered third-party hearsay and would likely be dismissed in court. Given the risks of presenting such evidence and the uncertainty of its value, they decided not to pursue it. Diane had expressed a desire to testify, feeling that her side of the story needed to be heard. But her defense team was hesitant. Her conflicting statements over the years and the potential for damaging cross-examination by the prosecution made them cautious about putting her on the stand. Ultimately, Diane didn't testify in her own defense. In fact, no witnesses were called for the defense at all. Instead, the defense focused heavily on creating reasonable doubt around the forensic evidence. On the other side, the prosecution countered that Diane had successfully given birth to multiple healthy babies in hospitals. Only the babies born in secret, those she hadn't sought medical care for, had ended up dead. They argued that this was no coincidence or accident. Diane had packed their remains into boxes and hidden them for nearly 20 years, actions that the prosecution maintained were clear signs of murder. The prosecution pressed that there was no way to reconcile Diane's behavior unless she had intentionally killed the babies. In a last-ditch effort, the defense called for a mistrial, hoping to discredit the case further. However, this request was denied, leaving the jury to decide the outcome based on the evidence presented. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read. The jury first addressed the 3 counts of intentional murder, and each time, the answer came back, not guilty. But then came the 3 counts of depraved indifference murder. The relief for the defense was short-lived because on each of these charges, the jury found Diane Odell guilty. Diane was sentenced to 3 terms, 15 years to life, 20 years to life, and 25 years to life, each to run concurrently. This effectively meant a sentence of 25 years to life. Diane Odell, now 71 years old, will be eligible for parole in May 2028. The case of Diane Odell leaves us grappling with many unsettling questions. How could a mother conceal so many dark secrets for decades? Diane's story was filled with shifting narratives, claims of abuse, coercion, and a mother who controlled her life. But as the details of her past unraveled, the line between truth and deception became harder to define. Was Diane a victim of her own upbringing, or was she the mastermind of these horrible acts? Let's hear your thoughts. While we may never fully understand the complex dynamics between Diane and her mother, one thing remains certain: the lives lost cannot be forgotten. As we await her potential parole in 2028, we must remember the importance of justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. Cases like this remind us that every wrinkle tells a story, and in the wrinkles of crime, we find the truth. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I'd love to hear your opinions or suggestions in the comments. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for our next video, and we'll explore another story hidden within the wrinkles in crime.